Have you ever pretended to be something you're not in order to get along at work? Well, you're not alone. Problem is, this can have long-term negative effects. I'm Dr. Jonathan. I work with organizations to make them inclusive, and I'm on a mission to help 1 million people like you to make your workplace inclusive. Get your pen and paper ready because we're talking about facades of conformity. About what? Facades of conformity. I'll explain in a little bit, but before I do, you should know that this is one of those concepts that not enough people talk about, despite the reality that so many of us have experienced it. This is going to make complete sense to you, and this show is the first in a 2-part series about facades of conformity. In this episode, I'm going to highlight 3 things that are useful for you to understand in your life about facades of conformity. So first off, let's understand the basics. What is a facade of conformity? It's a term coined by Professor Patricia Faison-Hewlin from McGill University in Canada. Professor Hewlin's done some really interesting work around this. I'll link to a paper in the show notes that I really like. It's called, and the award for Best Actor goes to, Facades of Conformity in Organizational Settings. The professor tells us that facades of conformity are false representations created by employees to appear as if they embrace organizational values. What do I mean by false representations? Well, it's a way of masking your true self and representing things that aren't true to you. When you create a facade of conformity, you end up suppressing your personal values while pretending to express values that you don't hold. Have you ever been in a meeting or speaking with colleagues at work and realized that you don't agree with the values that drive the work? How long did that last? A minute, an hour, a week? Imagine if it lasted months or years. I know some of you can relate to this. I can tell you that in a former life, this has happened to me on more than one occasion. Not once, it happened to me a lot. Knowing that you're contributing to something that conflicts with your own values takes its toll. But as part of the organization, as part of your work, to appear to be a functioning member of the team, your words, your actions need to align with the values and expectations of the organization. So here's the first useful thing that you need to know. Facades of conformity can be verbal and non-verbal. Pretending you buy into the values of the organization by saying things you don't believe is not an inconceivable idea, especially if you really need the job. At the time of recording, we're at the beginning of 2021. A lot of people have lost their livelihoods or are about to. A lot of businesses are unable to trade. This has a real human cost. I don't want to ignore that. And you know what? It's not just about the economic circumstances now. I come from a situation where I really needed the job, and a facade of conformity, that would have been standard. But it's not just about saying you agree with the values of the organization or talking about them as part of your work. It can be non-verbal. This includes the way you dress. Even nodding in agreement with people can be a facade of conformity. You can think of this as a form of impression management. We did a whole show on this topic. I reviewed a really interesting book on this topic, which I'll link to in the show notes. But here's the thing. A lot of the time, when people talk about impression management, there's a huge emphasis on how an individual manages the way that other people perceive them. Think about it. You want people to think of you in a particular way. Competent, confident, reliable, trustworthy, and so on. Impression management is about how you influence the way others perceive you so that they think of you in this way. What's useful about facades of conformity is that it goes a step further and it explores the conflict between your internal values and the values that you express. And this brings me to the second thing that's useful for you to know. Creating a facade of conformity is a response to perceived personal and organizational conflict. Let me say that again. Creating a facade of conformity is a response to perceived personal and organizational conflict. That means you know there's a conflict, you know there's an issue, and you're choosing to create the facade. I certainly did. The reason this matters to you is because it's personal. When Professor Hewlin was talking about facades of conformity, it was about day-to-day experiences, but it was about personal values, core values, stable values that we hold. The reason these are so important to us is they're linked to our identity. What's important here is that the values being addressed, they're considered to be stable over time. Think of values that are informed by your upbringing, your culture. These have a profound effect on us. It had a profound effect on me. My family's from Ghana. I grew up in a working class neighborhood on a council estate raised by a single mother. This influences my personal values, and sometimes those values didn't align with the organizations I worked for. I've worked in places where I felt that the thing we were selling didn't actually help people. I created a facade of conformity before leaving. I've worked in places where I felt that the thing we were selling didn't help people enough. We could have done a lot more. I created a facade of conformity before leaving. I've worked in places where I felt that the thing we were selling didn't provide enough value for what people paid. I created a facade of conformity before leaving. Even when I did my PhD, I had to create a facade of conformity because not everyone was supportive of my research and what it meant. A lot of people experience this every single day. What's fascinating is that things got better for me when I dropped the facade. But it was so risky. It's still risky for me. Even in this field of diversity and inclusion, I'm not part of the in-group. We're not like everyone else. And when I said we, that includes you. If you're listening to this show, then I want to believe that you're contributing to something that's aligned with your personal values. And if you're not, I want to encourage you to do so. Why? Because at the beginning of the show, I said that contributing to something that conflicts with your own values takes its toll. And this brings me to the third and final useful thing to know about facades of conformity. They can be distressful over time. Speaking from personal experience, to me, this was all standard stuff. It never occurred to me that it was possible to work in an organization where my values would be aligned with theirs. That says a lot, right? I always had to pretend, but pretending at work can be distressful. Acting inauthentically at work is emotionally demanding. I'm not talking about emotional labor. We'll discuss that in a future show. I'm talking about the negative tension you feel when you have to pretend at work. We know that people who alter their unique values, people who mute their unique values in order to fit into an organization's dominant culture, create a sense of alienation from themselves. Professor Hewlin draws attention to this. And this is indicative of one of the 3 biggest problems that organizations experience on their inclusion journey. Organizations struggle to create a culture of inclusion where everyone can reach their potential. This is where this topic can be misunderstood. Because organizations should be free to choose their values, right? People who join that organization should be expected to match those values, right? This is one of the reasons why we don't say bring your whole self to work. We say bring your best self to work. Not only that, what if the values on the website don't match the values in the business? What then? What if the business, the organization, the institution lacks integrity? When we're talking about values matching, can anyone with the right values be welcomed? Can anyone with the right values perform? Can anyone with the right values belong? These are important questions and we'll be picking this up in the next show. So let's wrap this up. What are the key messages here? 1. Facades of conformity mask your true self. 2. Facades of conformity are both verbal and non-verbal. And 3. Facades of conformity are a response to conflict. So what do you think? Are you creating facades of conformity at work? Get in touch or leave a message. I would love to hear from you. If you've learned something from today's show, then give us a review on iTunes. It helps other people like you to find the show. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.